that they are speaker this morning is that Zao MKE is the Share the Plate recipient this month. And with our forums this year, our virtual forums, we're inviting our Share the Plate recipients to join us on one of our forums. And so we'll hear about Zao Milwaukee. And we're also fortunate to know that we at First Unitarian Society of Milwaukee have a working relationship with Zao, and Reverend Overton and Reverend Jennifer Nordstrom are close colleagues who worked together in Chicago before they both moved to Milwaukee and are now here continuing that relationship. We've got some big events coming up this week, post-election, with Faith in the Streets, which we can also talk about. And you can see more about Reverend Overton's background in the information that was sent out previously. So I won't go into that, but just turn it now over to Reverend Jonah Overton. Welcome, Jonah. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Bruce, and thank you for the generous introduction. It has been my pleasure to work with Bruce previously with your social justice team committee, and I just love the work that First Church has been doing in the community since I arrived in Milwaukee, and obviously for so many years and generations prior. I came to Milwaukee about 4 years ago, a little over 4 years ago, from Chicago, where I had been a community organizer and a seminary student. I felt really drawn into church planting, which is one of the names they have for people like me who start churches from scratch. Basically, having grown up in a Christian church where I really identified with the person of Jesus, with the stories of scripture, but not so much with a lot of the expressions of church I encountered, I knew that there had to be different ways of doing church. I'm out as a queer person, as a trans person, I'm non-binary, and I am deeply involved in the work of social justice. For me, those things are really tied to my faith and to my Christian identity, but they didn't always fit in a lot of the Christian communities I encountered. So I went to seminary and I got credentialed. And I met other people who had similar understandings of the Christian scriptures that I did, and their call to build inclusive churches that were deeply and publicly dedicated to the work of justice in the world based on our faith. And so I started meeting these other people who had built churches from scratch. And I thought, wow, if we really want Christian churches to look different than they do, or if we want there to be more options for people like me to be involved in Christian church spaces, maybe we need to start building some new ones. There are certainly many congregations who are moving and shifting, who are becoming more oriented towards justice or more inclusive of LGBTQ people. But as we do that difficult work, we also need to start and seed new communities that can be welcoming to all people and advocating for a world of justice and peace. So I came to Zao. Now, I was sent to Milwaukee to build a church community from scratch. And that meant that when I arrived just over 4 years ago, I had the names and phone numbers of 2 people who lived in the River West neighborhood of Milwaukee, and that was it. It was just me. I moved into an apartment in River West and had 2 contacts, and that was the basis of building this church. So I started going all around Milwaukee, going to poetry readings and justice rallies and you know, the cooperatively owned neighborhood bar, and just meeting people and seeing if there were folks who were passionate about justice and about inclusion and about spirituality. And from there, we started gathering in my living room. I realize now I don't have any pictures from that time, but we were gathering in my living room, and it began with a couple of people on a Wednesday night. And then within about 8 months, we had grown so large. We were about 35 people. We were pressed up against windows and sitting on the ground and perched on arms of furniture. And so we needed something else. So we started a monthly worship service at the Miramar Theater. And if y'all will let me, I'm just going to share my screen real quickly to show you what that was like for us. So, oh, this is too many pictures. Are you all seeing several pictures here? Or are you just seeing the one? Can people say one or?
Just the one.
Just the one, okay, great. So you're seeing something different than I am, but good. Okay, so this is us at the Miramar Theater. I don't know if you can see in there, there's a ladder. It's a theater that is set up as a music venue, and it's not really meant to be church, but that actually was quite freeing for a lot of our community members. You see, most of the people who go to church at Zao have some sort of complicated history with the Christian church. Either they are new entirely to Christianity and didn't always have a great opinion of it, or they grew up Christian and were very harmed by the Christian church, usually around oppressive theologies of anti-LGBTQ understandings of scripture, or just otherwise having some spiritual trauma. And so actually, when we went through our phase of meeting at the Miramar Theater, we kind of had this opportunity for folks to get their toes wet in a space that didn't look like traditional church. A lot of people would joke, oh, I can't go to church. The minute I step inside a church, I will be struck by lightning. But no one felt like they were going to be struck by lightning at this theater that we were at. And so it was kind of a good middle ground for us. And we would play music and light candles, and we started building this church service. We were at the Miramar Theater for nearly 2 years as we grew and grew. And it became a little untenable for us because we needed to set up and tear down our equipment every time. So we only did it twice a month. So after that, as we continued to grow, we ended up moving to a former United Methodist church. We're affiliated with the United Methodist denomination. And there was a church that used to be known as Kenwood United Methodist. Some of you may know it. It's on the east side and across the street from the UWM Student Union. And it had been sitting empty for 2 years. And so the denomination decided they wanted to support us in this way. They let us move into this now very traditional church building with an altar and everything. But we brought our same kind of sparkle, our same candles and practices, and we draped things in rainbows and made sure that everyone felt completely welcome here. And it's been an absolutely transformational experience for us. When we first started in my living room, like I said, we were just a couple of people. By the time we were at the Miramar Theater, we were maybe 40 or 50 on a Sunday morning. And when we got to the old Kenwood building, and so now our new home, we really blew up. And by the time we shut down for COVID reasons, we were worshiping about 100 every week on Sunday morning. So that was a real incredible journey for us. At Zao, we talk about who we are by saying that we are Jesus-rooted, justice-centered, and radically inclusive. So those Jesus roots, first of all, that's a way for us to identify as Christians. There are many people who are not Christian who are members at Zao and even leaders at Zao, people who are Buddhist or atheist or agnostic. We have some members who are Jewish, and folks bring their different spiritual identities and perspectives into the space. And we want to honor and uplift those different experiences. And we want to make sure that we're clear who Zao is as a whole and what we're kind of teaching from the front, which is Jesus. Now, the reason we do that is because we want to make sure that there are explicitly Christian spaces that are affirming and committed to justice, places that people can encounter Christianity and Jesus in a very different kind of way. And so we find that when we do that, even people who are not Christian still occasionally find that it is the correct home for them to be on a spiritual path with others. So that's a really thrilling thing. The other reason that we talk about being Jesus rooted is because we have discovered that American Christianity seems to have lost its roots a lot of the time. Is based on a culture that is pretty far removed from the teachings and expressions of Jesus. And so when we talk about our experience of Christianity or church, we want to root that back in the person and the teachings and the life of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, who we see as a brown-skinned Palestinian Jewish peasant under Roman occupation. The Gospels teach us that Jesus was a radical, and that leads us to very different conclusions than a lot of the American Christianity that we have encountered or grown up with or been steeped in our culture. So our Jesus roots lead us to our justice center. We believe that the teachings of Jesus were centered in justice and justice for all, and that living in accordance with the teachings of Jesus requires us to center the work of justice in our lives and in our faith. So that Jesus root brings us to that justice center. And ultimately, the centering of justice work results in the radical inclusion of all in the new way of being, in the kingdom, so to speak, in that Christian parlance. And so we work to be a radically inclusive community where folks are celebrated in every aspect of their God-given identity, including being LGBTQ, or being Black, or being a person with disability. Whatever identities are central to who a person is, they are celebrated in our community and not sort of argued over or fodder for theological debate. A real brief aside, the word Zao, the name of our church, is a Greek word, and it's from the New Testament of the Christian scriptures. It means to be among the living. Another important emphasis at Zao is that our spiritual journey is about being fully alive here on this earth. That doesn't mean that we don't have collective or various beliefs about what may come after our earthly death. It just means that when we think of the Christian church, a lot of times the church has leaned too heavily on some sort of reward in an afterlife that allows people to kind of endure earthly suffering that we believe is unjust. We believe that Jesus teaches that we ought to be fully alive here and now, advocating for the fullness of life of all people, and that eternal life begins now when we fight for the right of everyone to experience the fullness of life and not be subject to mechanisms of death or systems of oppression. And that's, again, an element in not only the joy that our community is really dedicated to, that we want to be fully alive with one another, that our goal, our spiritual path is about fullness of life, but also the work we're dedicated to in terms of justice, that all are deserving of the fullness of life, and that anywhere there is death or captivity, it is our responsibility as followers of Jesus and people of faith to bring freedom. And so one of the other places that you will find members of the Zao community, in addition to church on Sunday mornings, is out in the streets. So I want to show you the first ever street action that we dreamed up ourselves. Was after the Trump administration had released a memo about eroding the rights of trans people. Because we were so well known already as a trans advocacy organization, since I'm trans and so is our co-pastor Cameron, who is my partner, we put together a protest. We had about 200 people out, and we were really thrilled to be able to gather community members to speak out on behalf of the rights of trans people. And so, you can see me there in the front with the bullhorn here. That's Cameron. I can also share another more professional picture of Cameron as well here. Let me pull that up. Oh no, I'll stop sharing here and give you a different glimpse of Cameron. This is Cameron. He uses he, him, his pronouns. He is a binary trans masculine person, so he's a man, and he's a trans man. He's my partner, and he and I pastor together And so he also is very invested personally in the rights of trans folk, but in general, to the rights of all people. And so he's central in our activism and advocacy work across all things. So you can see him again in that full screen of us out into the streets. So that was one of the first that we ever did together. But we are often out in the streets. Here is a picture of the last Pride Fest, not the most recent one in 2020. That was a very different gathering because it wasn't safe to do Pride the traditional way. But the last pre-COVID Pride Fest that we had, I think this isn't even the full group, but we had about just shy of 50 people who came out with Zao to Pride Fest. And it's including Fannie Mae Del Mar, who is the queen you see with the fan and the pink hair, standing next to Cameron. Fannie Mae is the alter ego of one of our community members, Jordy. And sometimes Fannie Mae will come full drag and be our liturgist on Sunday mornings, which is really delightful. But this is a way that we witness, that we bear witness to one another, that faith and Christianity and queerness go hand in hand, and that you can be celebrated by church in the fullness of who you are as a queer person. Similarly, I want to pull up one last picture of us at Pride Fest in our booth. This is another opportunity for us to bring joy and celebration, and also to celebrate people as who they are, to say, we don't expect everyone to come to church. Church should come to you sometimes. And so we go to Pride Fest every year. We pay for a full booth in the regular vendor location just to shower love on people and let them know that we're here and we adore them. And then finally, I want to share a picture with you that is from Ash Wednesday. This is another way that we bring church kind of out into the streets. So we celebrate Ash Wednesday, which is a time where we remember our mortality, and we offer ashes for people to put on their foreheads. And this is two of our members outside of Colectivo Coffee. On Ash Wednesday, we offer traditional ashes for those who want those. We also offer glitter ashes, which is a way to continue to remember our mortality and lament, but also specifically to lament the ways that LGBTQ people have been burdened and broken and persecuted by the Christian church. And so it's, and it's also, so you can take it in that very, very somber way of saying, I want to wear the ashes, the glitter ashes on my forehead to remember and grieve the loss of queer people in the church. Or you can take it in more of a lighthearted way and say, even as we grieve and remember our mortality, we also have the glittering hope of queerness and the fullness of God's creation in our community. So let me pull that out. So that's Zao. We are a largely, if you may have noticed from the pictures, we are a really young community. The vast majority of our community members are in their 20s and 30s. A slight majority identify as LGBTQ, but that means that almost half identify as straight and cisgender. But those are folks who want to be a part of a Christian community that explicitly supports LGBTQ people. And of course, we have people who come to us because of our commitment to justice work. We find that being a Christian community committed to the healing of people and committed to dealing with spiritual trauma has been really important. There are some people that experience trauma in the Christian church who need to leave the Christian church forever, and we honor that and respect that. If folks want to leave an explicitly and exclusively Christian church and but still remain part of a spiritual community, we recommend that they check out any number of places, including we say, have you tried Unitarian Universalism? We know some really great congregations in the area. But so there are some folks who need to not be a part of a mainline Christian denomination anymore. But there are also folks who need to go back to those places where they first encountered God to heal the wounds inflicted by those who harmed them when they were vulnerable. So for instance, there are people who grew up experiencing the divine, feeling loved and adored by God, but then deeply harmed by people or by institutions of the church. And those folks find that they need to go back to a different kind of church in order to heal those wounds and continue to experience God. So we are really honored to be a place of healing for a lot of people who thought that they would never go back to church again. We did a community survey, and many folks said that if Zao didn't exist, they wouldn't go to church at all. And another group of folks said that before they found Zao, they didn't think they would go to church ever again. And so it's a real honor to be a part of people's processes of finding spiritual community and spiritual healing. Community is an enormous aspect of what we do. In that same survey, 82% of our respondents said that because they come to Zao, they feel less alone than they did prior to finding Zao. They have found a sense of community and attachment and relationship. We have formed communities that go well beyond the bounds of the church now. People who socialize together, people who love one another, people who have gotten married. And so finding ways to build that sense of community, especially among young people who are feeling particularly isolated right now, has been really incredible. Now, because of our demographic, folks in their 20s and 30s, disproportionately queer and disproportionately single, they are not financially gifted to support Zao in the same way that some other communities are. So we do have a disproportionate financial need. We have some very generous givers. The majority of active members in our community do give and are committed to recurring giving. Some of our community members are really proud of their gift that they give every month of $3 or $5. And we celebrate that no matter what a person has, the ability to choose a community and invest in a community is incredibly powerful. And what that means is that we really do rely on communities like First Church and the generosity of the Pass the Plate program and other folks who are willing outside of our community to continue to invest in this community at Zao to keep us afloat and to make sure that we will always be around to receive people who are in need of that spiritual healing, in need of that community to embrace them when they have felt so alone and so rejected by the Christian church in the past. The place where you all may encounter us most often is through FIST. Now, this is kind of getting back to how Reverend Jennifer and I know one another. Back when I was in Chicago, she also was in Chicago, serving another Unitarian Universalist congregation. And we knew each other through my community organizing and activist circles. We were both involved in some really important justice campaigns in Chicago. And so when we moved to Milwaukee, at the same time, we didn't realize, we didn't know each other well enough to have heard about one another's moves. But when we started to get here and do our good community organizing practice of checking in with the clergy of other congregations in the area, we said, oh, I just moved here from Chicago. Oh, I just moved here from Chicago. Oh, wait, were you at this event, the Unitarian Universalist Justice event? Yes, of course. So it was really great to reconnect in that way. And as we both got established in Milwaukee, we thought, we could really do some incredible work together if we intentionally build an action mobilization network for people of faith. And so we dreamed up together FIST, Faith in the Streets Together, which is our effort to mobilize members of our own communities, the First Church and Zao, but also other faith communities of any kind who want to mobilize for justice and be in the streets together. And so we started that just before the pandemic kind of quarantined us all. We had one successful outing in January where we turned out over 40 people to go to hit the streets advocating for justice and equity. And then the quarantine happened. Now, during the quarantine, we didn't stop doing the work of justice. In fact, when local Black Lives Matter activists declared that there would be 200 days of protests in Milwaukee, Zao was connected enough to the street leadership and to the street movements to learn that we needed to be a part of the supply chain. It takes a lot of material support to have 200 days of protests. And most of that is water, Gatorade, salty snacks, anything that helps keep people's electrolytes in the right place, give people nourishment and hydration so that nothing knocks them out in the street, but also first aid materials and items like megaphones and generators and tents. So in June, we opened up the Zao Depot. This is the largest supply drop and distribution center in the Milwaukee area for protests. And anybody who needs supplies knows that they can come get them for free at Zao. I'm going to share with you real quickly here a picture of what we like to call Water Mountain. This is our collection of water in our gymnasium. We have since moved it to the parlor, but this is water that was all donated by community members. And that whole mountain has since gone and replenished and gone again. And so all summer we have been working as an expression of our faith in the streets to keep street movement and leadership and activists hydrated and healthy and fed and safe. So that has been an enormous part of our work and really has kind of put the building, Zao's building, on the map with local activists. We didn't get to worship inside the building for very long before we shut it down due to COVID, but we feel that the whole reason that we were called into that space is so that we could turn this beautiful large community building into the depot, so that the movement could be resourced and people could feel the support of communities of faith as they are marching in the streets, and that we could join them in the streets fully hydrated and protected. So I'm going to go ahead and stop there and open up to any questions you all might have. Thank you so much for having me here, and I really would love to get to know you all better.
Thank you, Jonah. I will watch for any questions in the chat that anybody has, but we've also got few enough people that perhaps people can just unmute themselves and speak up when there's a break in the discussion. I'll just start out with a question and ask about the relationship to the Methodist Church. As I understand it, the Methodist Church is close to facing a schism over this issue of queer and gender rights, especially on the ministerial level and welcoming congregations and so on. So can you say a little bit about what's going on with that and your relationship to the Methodist hierarchy?
Yeah, Bruce, thank you for that question. You are absolutely right. The United Methodist Church is in a deep conflict about the rights of LGBTQ people. Within the church and in the world. One of the struggles that the United Methodist Church has is that we are a global denomination. If we were just voting based on where the churches in the United States stand, the United Methodist Church would have become LGBT affirming many years ago, along with the ELCA and some of the other mainline Christian denominations. However, the United Methodist Church is a global denomination and has a history, as many Christian organizations do, of exporting misogyny and homophobia and colonialism along with their missionaries. And so there is this really troubling history of United Methodist missionaries going back generations ago to places like Africa and Asia, and getting there and discovering queer identity or different forms of marriage, different ways of organizing the family, and really coming down hard and saying, God says, one man, one woman, this is what it is, end of story, and all of that being wrapped up with all the colonialism that we all know is really problematic in Christian missions. And so now the U.S. Christian church is reaping the misogyny and homophobia that we sowed. That generations later, those folks in Africa and Asia are like, this is what you taught, this is what you came. You actually stripped our community of its richness in these ways. They wouldn't identify it as richness anymore because folks have bought into it. And so So our problem is that globally we can't really get it together. I think that there are a lot of different ways that people approach this. Some people leave the denomination and say, I'm going to a more progressive denomination, I'm going to a more inclusive denomination. My calling really felt like I'm just going to build the church that I feel called to build. And it seems like the connections and the opportunity is there within the Methodist Church. And I really want to follow kind of where I feel the Spirit moving. And if they throw me out, they throw me out. And so far they haven't. So far, actually, we have a tremendous amount of support, especially in our local Wisconsin churches. And so we're actually leveraging this to show that churches can and do thrive when LGBT people are centered and affirmed and celebrated, as well as the work of justice for all people. So we're just chugging along. I think it's worth noting that in addition to the work of Zao specifically, Cameron and I have begun working with a number of other young LGBT Methodists to start something called the Liberation Project. I'm sharing one of our kind of sneak peek items here. Liberation is coming. The Liberation Project is a bunch of young leaders, many of whom are LGBT and or people of color, and engaged in the work of bringing full liberation to all Christian churches, including the United Methodist Church. And so the Liberation Project is one of the ways that Cameron and I and Zao are really pushing within our own denomination and beyond for LGBT inclusion in the church.
Okay, we've got a question from Jerry Fredrickson. Did you ever get your supplies back that were confiscated in Kenosha?
Yeah, okay. So for those who don't know, thank you for the question, Jerry. For those of you who don't know, when we were helping bring those supplies from the depot out to various parts of the community, there was one incident where some community members from Kenosha, after the brutal public shooting happened there, so these members of the community in Kenosha came and filled up a U-Haul at the depot. And while they were going back to their community to engage in protest, they were stopped by police, and the entire contents of that U-Haul, which we estimated to be about $1,000 worth of materials, were confiscated. And the short answer to that, Jerry, is no. We did not ever get those materials back. Now, there was this kind of back and forth with the police, and ultimately what we said was, we don't want them back. We had already given them to those Kenosha community members that were driving that U-Haul. They weren't really in our possession when they were confiscated anyway. We said we gave those materials to the Black Lives Matter protesters of Kenosha, so we don't want them to come back to us. The police have an obligation to get them back where they were headed and to the people that they were stolen from in the first place, which was the Black Lives Matter movement and the Black Lives Matter leadership. Luckily, we did have an incredible outpouring of support around that time, got even more donations of water and food and all of the things that were needed. And so we were able to get people supplied with exactly what they needed in that moment, and even supplied kind of into a little bit in the future. So that was a really troubling incident. I think we were less concerned with the specific items that were confiscated from those activists, and more concerned with the idea that the police were willing to confiscate water. That seems like a really brutal violation of our social norms at the very least. And that we as a church could bring a lot of attention to that, to say, if you're stealing water from churches who are trying to make sure people stay safe, you're probably not on the right side of history here. And so for us, it was less important to get those items back, or even back to the protesters, as much as it was important to really get the word out that this is what the police were doing at this time, and then doing our best to resupply so that we could make sure that nobody went thirsty out on the street.
Okay, another question from Terry. Can you talk about what's happening on Wednesday and beyond? And do you need more supplies now?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Terry. On Wednesday, as an expression of FIST, Faith in the Streets, we are preparing to be out in the streets and to make sure that our election happens as fairly as possible and that every vote is counted. That's why FIST had FIST sponsored an event of civil disobedience training, 101 and 201 this last week. And if you missed those and wanted to catch up, there are recorded Zoom links. And so you can reach out to, I think it's staff members of First Church to receive those recordings and get trained up and get more familiar. But anyone is involved in, anyone is invited to be involved in the work of Faith in the Streets. We've started a signal thread, which is a method of secure encrypted communication where we can alert one another to when and where we would like to gather in the streets to defend democracy and advocate for the counting of all ballots in this next week in particular. So we're planning to be out on the streets on Wednesday at 2 p.m. And if you would like to get on that signal thread, you can actually contact Terry about that. And we will get you into the loop communication wise.
Jennifer, our minister, Jennifer Nordstrom was one of the keys in getting this organized on Wednesday. And we have a new Defend Democracy work group that Kathy Rivera and several others are involved with, because we're very concerned about this election. So you can find out more about this Defend Democracy work group by emailing Kathy Rivera, I think. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong about that.
No, that sounds right. Thank you, Bruce.
Yeah, Kathy will send the links.
Yeah, Kathy will send the links. We're asking for people to volunteer in different ways. You don't have to be marching in the street in protest. We need people to support, to make signs, to hand out supplies, to support people in different ways. So
is there anything that can be done?
Go ahead. Is that Molly asking?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I was trying to speak it into my chat, but I'll ask directly. I'm very concerned about the cutoff in counting the votes. To me, that's already a violation of just the principle of counting every vote. Is there anything that can be done about that situation?
Yeah, I mean, I think from our own experience, we know that being in the streets actually has an enormous impact. And that's why the focus of Faith in the Streets is an action mobilization network that when violations of our civil liberties like that occur, the folks who are violating those liberties count on us kind of quietly and begrudgingly accepting what they've done as reality. And when we can make a big public display of how we will not stand by and let that happen and let everything proceed as normal, that's when they start to walk back these violations. Now, the cutoff point has sort of already happened in Wisconsin. They created the cutoff point, they actually went back on it, and then they did it again. We may or may not be able to really affect that. But we know that on the whole, making sure that we are out in the streets as publicly as possible and demanding that every vote be counted will be critical. And that's a part of this, is to say, you know, if you need to extend the deadline to count every vote, then do it. But we will not remain silent as you disenfranchise voters. If you're unable to physically be in the streets, as Bruce mentioned, there are many ways to support people being in the streets. And that's what the Depot is all about, is about saying, you know, there's a lot that goes into making sure that everyone can be out in the streets safely who is out. And so whatever we do, making sure our efforts are geared towards public resistance and demands for true democracy is going to be really essential at this time.
Okay. Where do people go if they want to make a contribution to the Depot?
If you want to make a contribution to the Depot, if you want to make a contribution to Zao, and Zao is putting a lot of our own resources behind this. So I would actually ask that if you are wanting to make a broad contribution to the depot, to the well-being of the depot, and to the ability of the depot to stay open. I would ask that you make just a general donation to Zao. You can do that by going to zaomke.org/give. I will put that in the chat real quick.
Or you can make a contribution any of the Sundays this month at church through Share the Plate, through our regular collections. And that will be, as I mentioned before, Share the Plate recipient this month. But donations of water and supplies and things like that, we just take directly to Zao, which is across from the Student Union at UWM on Kenwood. Are there certain hours where people need
Yes.
to make those donations?
So I'm going to put in here, whoops, the contact information for that. So we used to have, at the very beginning, when there were a lot of actions going on all the time, we had a 24/7 depot. That was enormously difficult to maintain, but it was really important in the very beginning. Then we shortened our hours, but we were still open from 8 a.m. to midnight for several weeks. As things have tapered off, as the weather has gotten colder and actions are more often planned in advance, we've moved entirely to an on-call system. So I'm going to put in the chat a phone number that you can call. So this is a phone number that you can call to schedule an appointment. So basically what happens if you want to make a donation of material items, you can collect that donation and call this number, and whoever answers, oftentimes it's me, but it might be another one of our volunteers or leaders, will talk to you about scheduling a time that's appropriate to come and drop things off. I will say that we will have folks at or around the building all day on election day. And so if you want to get material donations to us in advance of Wednesday's protest, or to supply folks who are doing election defense or protecting polling places, you can drop materials by any time on Tuesday during election day. Otherwise, you can call that number and schedule an appropriate time to drop items off.
Okay, great. If you don't have access to the chat, that number is 414-885-4085. 414-885-4085. And BJ is asking a question here. I'm sorry if you covered this and I missed it, but does Zao also work to fight ableism?
BJ, thank you for that. So yes, absolutely. Ableism is a huge topic in churches. And I think that one of the complexities of ableism is that disability shows up in many, many different ways in our communities. And so it's not like there's any one thing that will make our community more accessible. It's a growing edge all the time. And so we really lean on the members of our community to help us grow in this way. So for instance, we have some deaf and hard of hearing members of our community, and that has totally changed our worship over time. In the beginning, we didn't have any captions or translation, but now for probably over 2 years now, so pretty early on, due to feedback from members of our community, now we have an ASL interpreter at every one of our services. And once we've gone online, we make sure there's captioning for everything that we put up online. A lot of the other ableism that we've confronted in our community has been around mental health. And so we work with folks who are experiencing different kinds of disability that's often invisible, and try and incorporate advocacy within our community. We know that we have a lot of work to do. Even things like our building, this building that we inherited, is only about a third of it is wheelchair accessible. And so we want to make sure that all of our events that are public are happening on that 1/3 of our building. So that is a really nuanced aspect of our community, and one that we hope to continue to grow in forever, really.
Yeah, Thank you. BJ is trying to help us, is helping us work on captioning here and in other ways. So we thank you,
That's
BJ,
wonderful.
for that. We also have a ways to go on that. Any other questions? Molly is asking, I guess she came in a little bit late. She says, I understand the United Methodist Church is split into 2 divisions. How is Zao related? Could you just briefly recap that?
Yeah. So Molly, not to go too much into United Methodist politics, but it's actually more like a minimum of 3 divisions, maybe 17 of folks who are really upset over where the church is at with LGBT inclusion. Basically, when we started this church, we were like, we're going to do the work of the church on the ground. Our local congregation is going to be affirming. If they throw us out because of that, we will cross that bridge when we get there. And as we grew and started being kind of an example of what it meant to be an LGBT affirming church in the United Methodist context, we started getting a lot of support. It actually connected us to a lot of other LGBTQ leadership and congregations across the United Methodist connection. And now we are involved in some national work. And actually, Cameron and I are pioneering some new liberationist work within the United Methodist Connection to try and bring the church into a new and more inclusive future.
Thank you. My apologies for coming in late.
Not at all.
Okay, I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat now. Now's your chance to speak up if you want, if you have some questions or comments.
Yeah, Dennis here. I find it really exciting how you are kind of embodying what I feel to be the true message of Jesus in the Bible. It's really a very radical message. I mean, he was not only against the Roman Empire, he was against the Jewish establishment. And if you look metaphorically at his ministry, I mean, he had a Roman tax collector in his following, for God's sake. So just, I mean, looking at that psychologically, I mean, and thinking about what that metaphor is like for working with one's own psyche and shadow and stuff, it's just really exciting to see the way your group has embodied that message. And quite frankly, I think it's the type of thing that can give Christianity at least a decent name again. It just feels like it's been so abused by what's happened in this country. I'm not going to make any political statements, but in my personal sense, this is about as far from the type of Christianity that I started with back in
Few years ago.
58, a while ago. So kudos for the good work that you're doing, and let's hope we don't have to demonstrate too long on Wednesday and following.
Yeah, thank you for that, Dennis. That is absolutely who we intend to be and how we are inspired in our own faith tradition. And you know what? People who have followed the Jesus tradition in that true radical sense have never been embraced by the status quo, because it is it's counterculture, right? And so we don't expect necessarily that the rest of the Christian church will follow suit, but we do hope that we can, like Jesus, build this kind of underground movement of people who are really seeing the world differently and fighting for something better.
Well, I've got to get off to my Packers game, but thank you so much.
All right, go Pack, go.
Go Pack, go. Okay, not seeing any more questions in the chat or anybody speaking up here, so I'll go ahead and close it out. Thank you, Reverend Jonah. We appreciate your time and your wonderful efforts here in Milwaukee, partnership with First Unitarian Society of Milwaukee, and we look forward to continuing to work with Zao MKE.
Thank you so much, Bruce. It's been an honor, First Church. You all have always been so lovely to me, and I hope that I and Zao can return that kindness at every available opportunity.